The winter of 1847 was the harshest anyone in the Montana Territory could remember. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, transforming the landscape into an endless expanse of white silence. Sarah Mitchell stood at the window of her family's trading post, watching the frozen world outside with a mixture of awe and apprehension. At 22 years old, she had seen many winters in this unforgiving land, but something about this one felt different, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation of something momentous. Her father, Thomas Mitchell, was a trader who had built a successful business by treating all people fairly, whether they were white settlers, French trappers, or native tribes. This philosophy had earned him respect across the territory, though it had also made him enemies among those who believed in the expanding doctrine of manifest destiny. Sarah had inherited her father's sense of justice and his ability to see the humanity in every person, regardless of their origin or the color of their skin. That particular afternoon, Sarah had decided to check the traplines along the river despite her father's warnings about the dangerous ice conditions. She was skilled with a rifle, knew the land well, and had always been more comfortable in the wilderness than in the confines of their trading post. She wrapped herself in heavy furs, tucked her father's pistol into her belt, and set out into the blinding white landscape. The wind howled like a living thing, and the cold bit through even her thick layers of clothing. As she approached the bend in the river where her father's traplines were set, she heard something that made her blood run cold. It was a sound that didn't belong in the winter silence, a splashing and gasping that spoke of desperation and imminent death. Sarah ran toward the sound, her boots crunching through the deep snow, and what she saw when she reached the riverbank stopped her in her tracks. A man was in the water, struggling against the current and the chunks of ice that threatened to pull him under. But this was no ordinary man. Even from a distance, even half submerged in the freezing water, she could see that he was massive, well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and powerful arms that fought against the river's deadly embrace. His long black hair was plastered to his face, and she could see the dark stains of blood spreading through the water around him. He had been wounded, and badly. Sarah didn't hesitate. She had been raised to help those in need, and she knew that leaving this man in the river meant condemning him to certain death. She quickly assessed the situation, noting a fallen tree that extended part way over the water. She carefully made her way out onto the log, testing each step to ensure it would hold her weight. The man's eyes found hers, and even in his weakened state, she saw intelligence and strength in that gaze. He was Apache, she realized, noting the traditional markings and the way he carried himself even in extremis. Using a rope from her pack, Sarah created a loop and threw it toward the drowning man. It took 3 attempts, with her hands growing numb from the cold and her heart pounding with urgency, but finally he caught it. She braced herself against the tree and began to pull, using every ounce of strength she possessed. The man was incredibly heavy, his waterlogged body and his sheer size making the task seem almost impossible. But Sarah had spent her life doing impossible things in this harsh land, and she refused to give up. Inch by inch, she dragged him toward the shore. When he was close enough, he found footing on the riverbed and helped push himself toward safety. Together, they managed to get him out of the water and onto the snowy bank, where he collapsed, his chest heaving and his body shaking violently from the cold. Sarah knew that getting him warm was now a matter of life and death. She couldn't take him to the trading post, not yet. There were men there who would kill an Apache on sight, wounded or not. Instead, she remembered a trapper's cabin about half a mile up the ridge, abandoned for the season. It would provide shelter and a place to start a fire. The problem was getting him there. The man tried to stand but collapsed immediately, his wounds and the cold having sapped his strength. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. She got him to his feet, put his massive arm around her shoulders, and began the agonizing journey up the ridge. It took over an hour to cover that half mile. Sarah's muscles screamed in protest, her lungs burned from the cold air, and several times she thought they would both collapse in the snow and freeze to death. But she kept moving, kept encouraging him in English and gestures, and somehow, miraculously, they reached the cabin. She kicked open the door and helped him inside, laying him near the stone fireplace. Working quickly, Sarah started a fire using the dry wood stacked inside the cabin. As the flames began to grow, casting dancing shadows on the walls, she turned her attention to the wounded man. His injuries were severe. He had been shot twice, once in the shoulder and once in the side, and there was a deep gash across his ribs that looked like it had come from a knife. She heated water in a pot she found in the cabin, tore strips from her extra clothing to make bandages, and set about cleaning and dressing his wounds. As she worked, the man drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering words in Apache that she couldn't understand. She learned his name was Nako, which he managed to tell her in broken English during one of his lucid moments. Throughout the night, she tended to him, keeping the fire burning, checking his wounds for signs of infection, and forcing him to drink water when he was conscious enough to swallow. She couldn't leave him, and she couldn't go for help without risking both their lives. Dawn came slowly, painting the snow-covered world in shades of pink and gold. Nako's fever had broken sometime during the night, and when Sarah checked on him in the morning light, she found his dark eyes open and watching her with an intensity that should have frightened her but somehow didn't. He spoke to her in Apache, his voice weak but steady, and though she couldn't understand the words, she understood the gratitude in his tone. That morning, Sarah knew she had to make a decision. She couldn't keep Nako hidden indefinitely, and his wounds needed better care than she could provide in an abandoned cabin. She decided to take a risk that would change both their lives forever. She would bring him to the trading post and ask her father for help, trusting in Thomas Mitchell's sense of justice and his known fairness toward all people. The journey back was easier in daylight, though Nako was still weak and had to lean heavily on her for support. When they finally emerged from the tree line and the trading post came into view, Sarah's heart was pounding. She didn't know what reception awaited them, but she held her head high as she helped Nako through the door. The scene that greeted them was one of chaos. Several rough-looking trappers were inside, and the moment they saw Nako, hands went to weapons. But Thomas Mitchell stepped forward, holding up his hand in a gesture that commanded silence. Sarah's father was a man whose word carried weight in these parts, and when he spoke, people listened. Sarah quickly explained what had happened, how she had found Nako dying in the river and had saved his life. She spoke passionately about the injustice of letting a man die simply because of his heritage, and she challenged anyone present to prove they wouldn't have done the same. Her father listened quietly, his weathered face unreadable, and then he surprised everyone, including Sarah. Thomas Mitchell called for the doctor who lived 2 buildings down, a gruff old man named Henderson who had treated everyone from senators to outlaws without discrimination. While they waited, Thomas had Nako moved to a back room and ordered one of the men to heat water and gather clean linens. The trappers grumbled but didn't dare defy him openly, and slowly the tension in the room began to ease. Over the next 3 days, something remarkable happened. As Nako recovered under Dr. Henderson's care, stories began to emerge about who he really was. He wasn't just any Apache warrior. He was the son of a chief, a man known among his people for his wisdom and his attempts to forge peace with the white settlers. He had been ambushed by a group of bounty hunters who were collecting Apache scalps for profit, a practice that had become sickeningly common in the territory. He had killed 3 of his attackers before being shot and escaping into the river, where the current had carried him miles downstream to where Sarah had found him. This information changed everything. Thomas Mitchell saw an opportunity not just to save one man's life, but potentially to build a bridge between 2 peoples who desperately needed to find a way to coexist. He sent word to Nako's tribe about his location and condition, and 3 days later, a delegation arrived at the trading post. The arrival of Apache warriors caused panic among some of the settlers, but Thomas Mitchell personally met them at the door and invited them inside. The leader of the delegation was Nako's father, Chief Mangas, a man of such dignity and presence that even the most prejudiced settler couldn't help but feel respect. When he saw his son alive and recovering, something passed between father and son that transcended language, a communication of love and relief that needed no translation. Through an interpreter, Chief Mangas asked to speak with the woman who had saved his son's life. Sarah was brought forward, feeling suddenly small and uncertain under the chief's intense scrutiny. But when he looked at her, his eyes were warm with gratitude. He spoke at length in Apache, and the interpreter translated his words, which thanked her not just for saving Nako's life, but for seeing the human being rather than the enemy, for risking her own safety to help someone her people had been taught to fear. What happened next shocked everyone in the room. Chief Mangas turned to Thomas Mitchell and made a formal request. He wanted Sarah to marry his son. He explained through the interpreter that such a union would be more than just a marriage between 2 people. It would be a symbol of peace, a bridge between 2 worlds that had been at war for too long. Nako, who had been listening from his bed in the back room, called out his agreement in English, his voice still weak but determined. The room erupted in chaos. Some settlers were outraged at the very suggestion. Some of the Apache delegation looked equally uncertain. But Thomas Mitchell raised his hand for silence once more, and then he did something that would be talked about in the territory for generations to come. He turned to his daughter and said 5 words that would change her life forever. "Sarah, will you consider this?" He wasn't demanding. He wasn't deciding for her. He was asking his daughter to make her own choice, to decide her own future. It was a radical act in a time when fathers routinely arranged their daughters' marriages without consultation. Sarah looked from her father to Chief Mungas to the doorway where Nako had appeared, leaning heavily on the doorframe but standing on his own. Sarah thought about the moment she had heard Nako struggling in the river. She thought about the choice she had made without hesitation to save a human life. She thought about the hours she had spent tending his wounds in that cabin, seeing not an enemy but a person in need of help. And she thought about what her father had always taught her, that the content of a person's character mattered more than the color of their skin or the language they spoke. She asked for time to speak with Nako alone, a request that was granted after some debate. In the back room, with Dr. Henderson discreetly stepping outside, Sarah and Nako talked for hours. He told her about his people, about their way of life, about his dreams of finding peace between Apaches and settlers. She told him about her life at the trading post, about her love for the wilderness, about her own dreams of a world where people could see past their differences. They found they shared more than either had expected, a similar spirit, a similar courage, a similar vision for what the world could be. When Sarah emerged from that room, she had made her decision. She would marry Nako, not because her father commanded it or because a chief requested it, but because she chose it. She saw in this man a partner who would respect her strength, value her independence, and share her dreams of building something better than what existed before. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, incorporating traditions from both cultures in a ceremony that was unique in the territory's history. It wasn't easy. There was opposition from both sides, threats from those who saw the union as a betrayal. But Thomas Mitchell stood by his daughter's choice, and Chief Mungas honored his word, and slowly, something remarkable began to happen. Sarah and Nako's marriage became a focal point for peace negotiations between settlers and Apaches in that region. Their home, built halfway between the trading post and the Apache village, became a place where both peoples could meet and trade and talk. Not everyone approved, and there were always those who sought to disrupt the peace. But the marriage endured, and the bridge they built between two worlds grew stronger with each passing year. Years later, when Sarah was an old woman surrounded by children and grandchildren who embodied both cultures, she would tell the story of that winter day when she pulled a drowning warrior from a frozen river. She would talk about the choice she made, not just to save a life but to build a life, to see possibility where others saw only difference. And she would always end the story the same way, reminding her descendants that the most important moments in life are the ones where we choose compassion over fear, where we reach across divides to pull each other to safety, where we risk everything to save a stranger who might become family. The story of Sarah and Nako became legend in the Montana Territory, a reminder that even in the darkest winters, even in times of great division and conflict, love and courage and human connection can create something beautiful and lasting. They proved that seeing the humanity in another person, regardless of where they come from or what they look like, isn't just an act of kindness. Sometimes, it's the beginning of something that changes the world.